here. Good. Well, as the founding director of a project called Insiders, Outsiders, which as some of you may know is an ongoing celebration of the profound and rich and sort of pervasive contribution made by the refugees from Nazi Europe to British culture and indeed beyond. It's my very, very great pleasure to welcome you to this very special event. Now, some of you will know full well that the original plan was to hold it live in situ in the wonderful space that you will be getting a pretty good sense of via Zoom today. Way back, guess when, mid-March 2020. I don't really have to tell you what stopped us in our tracks there. And to our great regret, we felt compelled, we rescheduled twice, and each time COVID just meant that we felt we couldn't go ahead. And so too this time round, rather than postponing yet again and hoping for better times, which are coming, I have absolutely no doubt, we felt, right, let's bite the bullet, let's make the most of the capabilities of Zoom and reaching audiences from around the world. I think many listening in today from Austria, for example, to make it happen today. So here we are, virtually, but nevertheless, what we hope very much will happen today is to give you a vivid sort of insight and kind of evoke the sense of the physical space in which Ruth and Mark Beadle and Melanie Veasey are going to be talking from. There we are. Just a word about practicalities. If you would please make sure that you're both muted and invisible for the duration, I would be very grateful. If you have questions, comments, whatever, you know the ropes, please type them into the chat and I'll sort of be monitoring the Q&A at the end. Fine, no, I think that's probably enough by way of practicalities. Yes, I mean, the big difference, of course, is that we can't sadly offer you refreshments today, but nevertheless, you'll forgive us for that. So I hope very much that you enjoy what is to come. Let me just start by introducing our three speakers, starting in the order in which they'll appear in a few minutes' time. Mark Beadle, who you can see in the middle of the triumvirate on your screen, almost certainly, is by his own sort of admission, if you like, a modernist architect of the Romantic Pragmatist school. I'd love to know a little more, Mark, one day about what that actually means. He works as a practitioner. He actually, his architectural practice is physically located in Charoux's studio. And he lives in the wonderful building, which I've had the pleasure of seeing at first hand, with his lovely wife, Ruth Beadle, who I first got to know as my son's art teacher. I'll be completely personal there, but is primarily a teacher and of art in particular. Then after Mark, we'll be hearing from Dr. Melanie Veasey. She's a London-based art historian. Thank you. Specializing in figurative sculpture, visual concepts of freedom, that's something we can perhaps discuss later, Melanie, and in particular works by émigré artists such, of course, as Siegfried Charoux, who settled in post-war Britain. And then thirdly, but certainly not least, we have Gregor Anatol Bocksteffen, who's the museum manager of the Langenzenndorf Museum in Lower Austria, not a million miles away from Vienna, I'm told. He's the custodian of the Siegfried Charoux estate. He's curated, as you might expect, several exhibitions connected with Charoux and his achievements. For example, the Sculptor as painter, Treasures of Modernism, which I think I'm right in saying was dwelling on his collection, his own collection, am I right, of works by others. He's also the author of an anniversary brochure, Siegfried Charoux, Sculptor and Painter, which commemorated the 50th anniversary of Charoux's death in 2017. So I think without further ado, we should begin.
Good afternoon and welcome to you all, especially our friends in Langenzenndorf. We're sorry not to be able to greet you in person as originally planned, but trust that you understand the circumstances that have given rise to the changed format. By way of introduction to today's talk concerning Siegfried Charoux and help put his working life in England in more context, I'll begin the proceedings by giving you a brief illustrated history of the environment in which he lived and was creative. So here we are at Siegfried Charoux's studio in North London, in Hampstead Garden Suburb. Here's Siegfried Charoux himself standing on the garden front of the studio back in the early 1960s. Here's a general view of Hampstead Garden Suburb itself. At about 7 o'clock in the left-hand bottom corner, you can see a large area of green among the houses, and buried in there, immersed in the suburb, is Siegfried Charoux's studio. The word studio, derived from the Italian, means a place of study and concentration. Studios originated as a dedicated building type developed in the 19th century for artists as a combination of workshop, showroom, archive, and salon. Artists at that time, particularly painters, came to enjoy celebrity and status, and many demonstrated their standing by building a headquarters for their enterprise. The premises provided balanced light, generous space, height and volume, and often seclusion and sanctuary in an enclave set apart from the distractions of everyday life. Both the Hampstead Garden Suburb and Siegfried Charoux's studio offered those amenities. Here is its situation indicated by the star. You'll see it lies well back from the street in a small oasis of green. The studio was built in the mid-1920s for a portrait painter, Maurice Codner, who fully occupied the garden of his home by building said studio. It consisted of a large single room dominated by prominent windows in the north and east walls and a skylight to the north, providing steady, even light, effectively creating an atmosphere of the outdoors brought indoors. Maurice Codner was producing up to 40 portraits a year at that time of eminent society figures, among them the Queen Mother, Henrietta Barnett, the founder of Hampstead Garden Suburb, Kathleen Ferrier, the opera singer, and significantly, Nancy Astor, of which more a little later. Later, the single room was augmented by a skylit extension to the south front, and an adjacent tennis court was annexed with a rose garden, stone paths and steps formalizing the transition between the original and the new setting. In the late 1950s, Siegfried Charoux and his wife Margaret became the new occupants, with Charoux bringing with him much of his collection of sculptures. His sponsor in this was David Astor, who remained a lifelong friend and patron. And it was perhaps the connection between Nancy Astor and her portrait session that brought Charoux eventually to occupy this studio. Charoux developed the studio as a centre for his own artistic activities, extending west for service spaces equipped with a kiln, workbenches and lathe, and a service yard complete with a lightweight translucent canopy as indicated in the sketch, and a range of adjacent clay bins for his ceramic experiments and production. The house itself too was extended to accommodate the Charoux grand piano. You can just make this out at the top of the drawing. It was here that he lived and worked for a decade, producing works across a wide range of artistic disciplines, from sculpture to paintings and ceramics, surrounded by his collection of sculptures and artifacts, resulting from his lifelong creative commitment. And in the garden, he laid out an intimate sculpture park with many large-scale works populating the landscape, set on rubble plinths amid the sylvan surroundings of Hampstead Garden Suburb. And he established his darkroom in a former summer house. Following the death of Charoux in 1969, Margaret Charoux investigated the possibility of conserving the premises and the collection as a museum of his work. But despite all her best efforts, the necessary consents were not forthcoming from local authorities. Instead, she had the core of the collection transferred to Langensersdorf in Vienna and founded the Charoux Museum there, whose curator you will hear from later. Eventually, upon the death of Margaret, it was decided that the premises should be vacated to be occupied by a successor working in the arts. And in due course, following a lengthy selection process, we were fortunate to become the new custodians of what by that time had become a very dilapidated, though highly enchanting place. We set about carefully sorting through the residue of materials, effects and artifacts, and evaluated the buildings and landscape, and then painstakingly recreated all in stages over decades, repairing structural damage and incorporating many salvaged materials and details, always with the aim of maintaining the profound spirit of place and prevailing deep calmness and carrying on in the tradition of our predecessors. And in its fully fledged version that we evolved, here is a cartoon following the style of the earlier ones, showing the generation of the building. You'll see the extension to the west. You'll see the path leading out to the former sculpture garden. And here I follow with a few pictures of the degree of works that we carried out to conserve this studio and bring it back to creative life. Here, the complete corner has been removed. The entire roof is held up on scaffolding, inside and out, while everything below is repaired down to 13 feet in the ground and out to the west. Here, the extension is being built, having removed all of the collapsing workshops on the west. Here is the interior being repaired inch by inch throughout the ceiling, the beams and everything else, stitching brickwork together to restore it. Here's the west extension being completed. And here in the corner is the jewel in the crown, the summer house, which was to reveal its treasure as we sifted through contents. It was in this process that we discovered abandoned examples of Charoux's work in progress and equipment, and eventually in a bin in the erstwhile darkroom, the summer house, a treasure trove of discarded photographic negatives, which when carefully cleaned, provided a remarkable lens into the history of the place and Charoux's own personal view of it. So I will close with showing you a selection of these to give you a sense of how it was, together with a counterpart series of views of the studio and setting as it stands today. Here is the most remarkable perhaps of all. This is the view of Charoux's lifelong collection that had been brought from Vienna, queuing, as it were, to enter his new home. Here is the view of the sculpture park he created in the garden, which had previously been perhaps a tennis court or allotment. You see the sculptures standing on their rubble plinths. And you see Margaret Charoux on the far left, out in the orchard, visiting the sculptures and perhaps collecting fruit from the orchard of trees. This is a glimpse of the state of the studio before much of this collection, having found its home, was retransferred back to Vienna to its final resting place in Langenzersdorf. Here's a view looking towards the fireplace, which was boxed in order to make a plinth for even more of the considerable collection of maquettes and sculptures that Charoux had. But you'll see below also examples of his paintings and the materials with which he was working. Here, the violinist, which also exists as a painting. And you start to see the varied scale at which he was working, from maquette to really very large pieces. And you wonder at the sheer effort involved in creating these pieces, in creating them in these premises, and then transporting them to and fro, all the distance to the street and then far across Europe, both when they came and when they were transferred back. Here's a view into the studio annex, which leads out to the garden. And you'll see the considerable size of the piece to the left of the aperture into the annex, and the scale of the reader. Here's the reader looking east, and in the distance, a collection of many of the other maquettes. A very, very busy working studio, salon, and showpiece. And finally, the views today of the studio in its restored glory, with flowers burgeoning, everything nicely repaired, embodying the spirit, we hope, of Charoux as he once stood on exactly those paving stones, accompanied by his reader, companions in creativity. Here we are looking back out to the garden. You'll recall the picture of the sculptures on their plinths out in the garden, there on the far right, the darkroom. Here is a sun trap alcove we constructed using the stones salvaged from the plinths in honor of Charoux, where we can take our ease and sense his presence even in his absence. Looking back towards that fireplace that we discovered in what Charoux had turned into a cupboard to contain his artifacts, and now viewing through the new West Extension, looking through, and in the far distance you can just make out a table made of slate resting on the very trestles upon which Charoux carried out so much of his work under his awning. And finally, a view of the studio as it is today, with the north light to the left, the east light in the distance, giving balanced light, repose. The easel with a Charoux sketch, an esquisse for a quartet standing upon it, and the spirit of place restored to continue as we carry on the tradition he and Maurice Codner began of a centre of creativity and calm and reflection in the garden suburb. And I'll hand you over now to Melanie Veasey, who will explain to you in more depth the single-minded commitment of Charoux to a collection of work that he brought from Vienna, as well as the work that he produced here. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark, for your fascinating introduction to Charoux's studio. I would like to share some of my research for a forthcoming publication, illustrating the highlights and challenges of Charoux's remarkable life, focusing on the events and the distinctive sculpture styles that offer tantalizing insights into the vibrant character of a compelling artist who became utterly committed to civilian freedom, a theme still resonant today. Beyond the newly built Ringstrasse in Vienna, Charoux was born into inauspicious circumstances as a sixth and youngest child. His would not be the charmed life of bourgeois Vienna. His mother, Anna Buster, née Charoux with an S, not an X, was a widowed dressmaker of Czech ancestry. Later, politically inspired, Charoux's adult name became a play on the French words chat roux, red cat, derived from his mother's maiden name. His father, Joseph Kinich, a man of difficult character, was a civil servant who had previously served as a soldier in the Habsburg army of the Austrian Empire. During his childhood, Vienna was compelling as the empire of the mind, a sophisticated cafe society renowned for its artistic rebellious secessionists, led by Gustav Klimt, world-class musicians from Mozart to Mahler, its famed opera house, and Sigmund Freud's study of the subconscious mind. Vienna was truly the 20th century epicenter for cultured European free thinkers. Yet Charoux was to be an ill-fated Viennese youth, because Europe's fragile peace would cease at much the same time as his coming of age, having matured as heroic in build, fair-haired, blue-eyed, and with a magnificent head, he was like a much more amiable version of Beethoven. Reluctantly, Charoux was conscripted into the Austrian army in 1915. As the most harrowing and formative experience of his life, Charoux witnessed the Great War's mechanized destruction of Europe's fragile homogeneity. Although a peaceable young man, Charoux was made to fight Russian peasants against his will. Inevitably, he witnessed the full horrors of battle and the human frailties of soldiers of diverse nationalities. Demobilized in 1917, aged 21, for a time after the war, Charoux roamed the porous borders of Europe, specifically returning to Russia to explore the country, its communist ideology, and its culture. Returning home, Charoux identified with members of the Viennese artistic demi-monde, self-styled in the civilian uniform adopted by the young men of early 20th century Vienna. As Ruth Beadle commented, a style still recognizable in the self-portraits of Lucien Freud. Whilst externally, Charoux seemingly shook off the mantle of war, an internalized memorial was nurtured as the Viennese intelligentsia encouraged political debate and a questioning of authority, as exemplified by the coruscating critique of the Great War in The Last Days of Mankind, published in 1922 and written by the Viennese satirical dramatist Karl Kraus. Empire, government, and officers were no longer considered to be cogent. The irony of such liberal criticism was readily absorbed by Charoux's fertile imagination. In response, he began to caricature situations where overt authority patronized those who were oppressed. Among his earliest sketches was Untitled, where a stout doctor opines that an exhausted, starving peasant is rather overworked and undernourished, implausibly prescribing some rest and a holiday in Italy. Many of Charoux's increasingly bold political caricatures were printed in the socialist Arbeiterzeitung worker newspaper between 1924 and 1928. In total, over 130 cartoons were published, and Charoux began to make a name for himself as a political satirist, pillorying those whom he believed considered themselves entitled to govern. His cartoons were acerbic in their criticism of authority and the abuse of power. Presciently, by 1925, Charoux started to denote the Nazi swastika, the first in a title sketch, Murder Technician. Charoux studied sculpture at the Academy of Fine Arts under Professor Hans Bitterlich, a Habsburg court favourite, who had been commissioned to create the classical Empress Elizabeth monument from 1904 to 1907. Although Charoux studied the prescribed syllabus, he considered the aesthetic of sculpture to be too conventional and wearied, leaving the Academy in 1924 without graduating. In a radical aesthetic shift inspired by the exuberance of Art Nouveau and the secessionists, Charoux frequently executed his own interpretation of how sculpture could be, innovative, experimental, and modern. An early work in stone titled Pair directly responds to Klimt's The Kiss. In Charoux's carved couple, the nude standing figure of a man rests his acutely angled head upon the shoulder of the embraced figure of a woman. The sharp angle of the head is clearly mimetic of the composition of the kiss. Recognized for his artistic potential, by 1926, the Viennese municipal authorities granted Charoux an artist studio at Funchsenfeld, Vienna 12. Now attracting commissions, among them a bronze bas-relief of a man, woman, and child with two young sapling trees in the background, an allegory for youth and aspiration. Perhaps associated with a political pamphlet, the plaque, titled The Little Leaflet, was designed as a socialist propaganda award for excellence. This plaque is important because it was the first time that Charoux utilized the image of a young family to promote a socialist agenda, a motif to which he would return. Vienna's social housing boom of the 1930s provided Charoux with one of his most important commissions, the impressive 12-metre-long frieze of work, spanning the entrance to the interior garden of the Zuckerhof, a residential block. The building was named the Zuckerhof in 1949 in recognition of the generous relief campaign that the city of Zurich provided for the population of Vienna in the aftermath of the Second World War. Weighed with symbolism, the frieze presents 10 larger-than-life-size figures, 9 men and 1 woman. 8 of the figures are standing, whilst 2 are kneeling, in a symmetrical composition grouped across the frieze. The figures on the left of the frieze represent agriculture in an almost biblical depiction. Facing towards the right, one figure is digging the land, one scattering seed by hand from a cloth held open before him. The third kneels to scythe a stoop of wheat. The standing female figure holds bundled wheat, whilst the centered man offers sheaves of the crop to figures on the other side of the frieze. These peasants are dressed in loincloths. As the only nude figure in the frieze, the presence of the woman may be intended to represent Mother Earth or fertility. Demonstrating time and progress, the muscular figures of the men on the right-hand side of the frieze wear shirts, trousers, and heavy toe-capped boots. Facing left, they present as contemporary construction workers. The 2 standing figures on the outer right jointly support a construction girder on their right shoulder as they walk in unison. The middle figure kneels at a forging block holding a hammer in his raised right hand, ready to strike a blow. The 4th figure strains to carry a heavy cylinder. The centered man extends before him 3 tools: a wide, flat paddle, a hammer, and a sickle, symbolic of proletarian solidarity, no doubt inspired by Charoux's prior interest in Russia. The hammer representing the workers and the sickle representing the peasants. The frieze was intended to promote the integrity of the honest labours of a free people, described by art historian Margaret Garlake as simplified, classicizing, and unambiguously modern. Almost perfectly preserved, today the frieze remains as arguably the most accomplished of Charoux's public sculptures. Indeed, escaping fascist censorship, the frieze is the only one of Charoux's interwall public sculptures to remain in situ in Vienna. In 1930, the Viennese authorities announced a competition inviting designs for a monument to celebrate tolerance, personified by the 18th century German dramatist, critic, and writer on philosophy and aesthetics, Gotthold Ephraim Lessing. Lessing's plays, particularly the Jewish character Nathan the Wise, addressed the conflict of conscience, promoting the equality and benevolence which resonated with Charoux's increasingly liberal ethos. However, during the time since Charoux had won the competition, Vienna had already begun to decline into civic and political flux because the fascist Dr. Engelbert Dollfuss had risen to power as Chancellor of the Exchequer for Austria. This was an increasingly anxious time as Europe fractured under the ascendancy of fascism in a prelude to the leadership of the Austrian-born Adolf Hitler as Chancellor of Germany in 1933, and then as Führer of the Nazi Party in 1934. Yet despite numerous frustrations and delays, the bronze cast of this Lessing monument was eventually installed in the Judenplatz on the 15th of June 1935. It would be removed by the National Socialists on the 24th of November 1939 and smelted for armaments. As Europe destabilized, Charoux created one of his most profound portrait busts, 2 heads. This sculpture, completed in terracotta and another in plaster, presented a blend of modern continental and primitive art and was noted for its meaningful advances towards realism. Charoux's sculpture may personify lovers, or possibly the universal motif of a pietà, a mother mourning the loss of her son, which would have been pertinent after the Great War, as rumours of another war obsessed Vienna's intelligentsia. This compelling sculpture was probably among the last that Charoux undertook in his studio in Vienna, and for that reason it is important in concluding the early phase of works that he completed in Austria, each in turn indebted to the classical, the secessionist, the primitive, early European modernism, and to Russian culture. Aged 30, Charoux, a Roman Catholic, had married Marguerite Trebol on the 18th of December 1926. She was the daughter of a Jewish trading family. Marguerite was to have a significant impact upon Charoux's career. Although Marguerite has previously been described as a housewife, domesticity and motherhood were not for her. She was, in fact, an international textile trader, adventurous, pragmatic, independent and intelligent. She probably spoke English and possibly other languages too. Rather than settle into married life at home, Marguerite continued her career, visiting China in 1927, Russia and Poland in 1928, and New York in 1927 and 1929, experiences which she shared in an Austrian magazine article in 1931. Her passports evidence a dense collection of visas, permits, entry and exit stamps for a multitude of countries throughout the 1920s and 30s. Given that Charoux's works were exhibited in some of the European countries that she regularly visited, it is probable that she facilitated his international debut. However, as Vienna became an increasingly pan-German environment, Charoux and Marguerite were forced to contemplate their situation, their conclusion being that Charoux was unlikely to be able to progress his career as a sculptor because his liberal ideology prevented him from collaborating with the fascist administration. Of a lesser concern for them at that time was Marguerite's Jewish heritage, despite the red J for Jew now stamped on her passport, because in the mid-1930s, it was predominantly in Germany that Jews were being terrorized. Vienna was still considered to be safe for citizens, including those who were Jewish. Discreetly, the couple decided to take a holiday in England, boarding the train to Calais, the ferry to Dover, then a train to London, arriving on the 7th of September, 1935, an exodus that Charoux described as his self-exile. For Charoux and Marguerite, it was no longer possible to contemplate returning home to Vienna because the couple were both listed for execution in Hitler's notorious Black Book. In London, Charoux had three priorities: to learn to speak English, re-establish his professional practice, and to gain viable patronage. Lacking money for English lessons, Charoux turned to the BBC's radio programme, Children's Hour. Given his warm, effusive and charismatic personality, Charoux readily made friends in England, fortuitously meeting the aristocrat Lord David Astor at a cocktail party in London. Charoux asked Astor if he might model for a portrait bust. Not because I think you have an interesting head, but because you have a well-known name, and that might help me. Astor was highly amused at this sassy approach and took an instant liking to Charoux, in so doing becoming the lifelong friend and patron that Charoux so desperately needed, especially with another war pending. For reasons of national security, Churchill allegedly issued the infamous instruction to collar the lot. Presumed as a German-speaking enemy alien, Charoux was interned at the Hutchinson camp on the Isle of Man, although curiously, Marguerite was not interned. At Hutchinson, Charoux was united with other European émigré artists, including Kurt Schweiters, who undertook portraits of Charoux, and George Ehrlich. Ehrlich exhibited sculpture at the first Hutchinson exhibition of art. And at the second exhibition, Charoux presented a Baroque-styled sculpture. Charoux's drawings were inspired by the camp experience, including this important portrait of his friend Kurt Bohm, marking their shared bad times in captivity. Writing to the New Statesman, Charoux and other interned artists protested their innocence and demanded their freedom. Fortuitously, due to the intervention of the Astor family, specifically Lady Nancy Astor, then Member of Parliament for Plymouth Sutton, Charoux was granted an early release when the Astor family guaranteed the artist's integrity. Paradoxically, whilst interned as a potential enemy of the state, Charoux's early British work had been submitted, probably by David Astor, to the Royal Academy of Arts for the annual summer exhibition in 1940. Two sculptures were accepted: a round composition, now lost, and Athlete, also known as Standing Man. The creation of Standing Man may have been interrupted by Charoux's period of internment because the plinth is inscribed, done 1940 to 41, when England was bombed. It is probable that Charoux completed Standing Man at Clifton, the Astor's family seat, while seeking shelter there from the Blitz. This sculpture was later exhibited at the first open-air exhibition of sculpture in 1948 at Battersea Park. During the 1940s, Charoux's dynamic aesthetic began to rapidly develop, drawing heavily upon works of European modernism, particularly evidencing the influence of German sculptures such as Wilhelm Lemsbruck's elongated figures. Authority, completed in 1944 as a maquette for a war memorial, consolidated Charoux's experience of both world wars to manifest a work of stark partisan statement. Two opposing military regimes represent the extreme left and right in unresolved confrontation. Critically, Authority was among the first of Charoux's sculpture to utilize dress, or more specifically uniform, as indicative of status and therefore representative of oppression. Slumped between these two conflicted sentinels, the Lemsbruck-like vulnerability and desperation of a dehumanized civilian is visually augmented by the lack of clothing, which served to remove the final vestige of dignity for this victim, the shocking consciousness of which was later reinforced by television images broadcast from liberated concentration camps. Consequently, we begin to understand the significance of Charoux's judicious inclusion of clothing as something more than mere surface decoration, at a time when many British sculptures continued with the over-familiar theme of the nude woman. Now widely recognized as a man who had fought and suffered for freedom, Charoux was commissioned by the Women's Engineering Society to create a posthumous portrait bust of their president, the aviatrix Amy Johnson, who had disappeared from the skies on the 5th of January, 1941. Referencing hundreds of family photographs, Charoux captured Johnson's indomitable character in a vibrant likeness of the intrepid adventuress wearing her flying helmet and leather coat, with the collar raised against the wings and her gaze inclined skywards. Seemingly ungendered, the memorial presents as a courageous, pioneering free spirit, easily misread as a Second World War pilot. The Labour austerity Chancellor of the Exchequer from 1947 to 50, Sir Stafford Cripps, was initially known to Charoux as a friend of Astor's and attended the unveiling of the Amy Johnson Memorial, consequently commissioning his own portrait bust by Charoux, which was exhibited at the Royal Academy in 1946. This commission and their shared passion for liberty, socialism, politics, and democracy nurtured their lifelong close friendship. Just a month after his 50th birthday, Charoux's application for British citizenship was uncontested and issued on the 15th of November, 1946. Such prized citizenship signified a momentous climax in Charoux's British cultural assimilation, which was further celebrated by his unanimous nomination for membership of the Royal Society of British Sculptors in 1947. The kudos that such membership brought ensured that he was invited to participate in social and professional events, thereby expanding his network. For the Royal Academy's summer exhibition in 1948, Charoux presented Youth. This accomplished, though uncontroversial sculpture appealed to the conservative mainstream. Youth captured the attention of the academicians, who purchased the sculpture at a cost of £1,000 for the nation's Chantry collection held by the Tate. This significant acquisition led to Charoux's election as an associate of the Royal Academy in 1949. Regrettably, due to copyright, it has not been possible to screen an image of Youth, but please do look for this sculpture online. Despite not having graduated from the Academy of Fine Arts in Vienna, nor ever having previously taught, Charoux enthusiastically volunteered his services to the Royal Academy Sculpture School and served as a visiting master in 1950, promoting works for public sculpture. Charoux proposed a memorial for a citizen, and his students, including Frank Martin and Melanie Veasey, explored possible local sites. In Charoux's words, "We earmarked the Little Palace Square off Pall Mall and went one day to the square to examine it for the actual spot on which such a memorial could be erected. Afterwards, we discussed in the park all the aspects of our problems, aesthetical ones, as well as economical and even political." Charoux opened the minds of the students to experiments, techniques, and possibilities beyond the accepted norm of the academicians, who by now considered him to be utterly radical. Charoux accepted the Festival of Britain's bold commission for the Islanders, which would become his most well-known British sculpture. As one of the few artists who understood the sheer scale of the festival's site, the Islanders optimized this public arena, when many works were criticized for being too small, including those by Jacob Epstein, Henry Moore, and Barbara Hepworth. Monumentally scaled, the Islanders was criticized in the art journal Apollo as overtly representative of socialist realism. Perhaps there was an element of truth in that, given Charoux's familiarity with Russian sculptures. Echoing his earlier manifestation of the family group of three that we saw in The Little Leaflet, and anecdotally representing George Orwell, his wife Eileen, and their adopted son Richard Horatio, the Islanders represents wartime Britain, emblematic of the stoic interdependence of a family who simultaneously conveyed solidarity against their past troubles whilst looking towards a promising future. However, it was also symbolic of the government's commitment to re-establish traditional family roles and encourage an increase in the post-war birth rate, a generation later termed the baby boomers. With success came the confidence to experiment with a wholly idiosyncratic style, fusing elements of Cubism, the Baroque, Art Nouveau, and American culture. The Pedestrian was a revelation. This was a work for the proletariat. Sarah McDougall of the Ben-Uri Museum attributes Charoux's stylistic development as having been aesthetically liberated by exile. The strong jawline of the face conveys an affirmation towards the influence of Cubism. The loosened tie and jaunty gait characterizing the intrinsic Americanism of post-war British culture. Charoux's first year as a member of the Royal Academy's Selection and Hanging Committee for the summer exhibition was in 1953. His participation prompted gleeful press comment. Advanced guard sculptors may feel cheered to know that their efforts will be looked after by Siegfried Charoux. By 1956, Charoux was promoted from associate to that of full Royal Academician. Crucially, Charoux's nomination of other artists for membership of the Royal Academy led to the election of several previously interned émigrés, including George Ehrlich, Uli Nimsch, and Willi Sukop. Both Nimsch and Sukop were eventually appointed as masters of the Royal Academy Sculpture School. This diversity not only provided the émigrés with opportunities for assimilation and public commissions, but also brought considerable benefits for the students, who enjoyed greater knowledge and understanding of European modernism. The third phase of Charoux's professional practice was titled the Civilization Cyclus, attributing this development to his sculpture practice to the greater political freedom that he had enjoyed in Britain. In stark contrast to his early works, the surface treatment of the Civilization Cyclus is notably gritty, coarse, and distinctive, an acceptance of something other than perfection, ideal for urban symbolism. The series was inspired by those who shared his London life. Consequently, they became a statement of the Englishness that he observed and experienced. To date, it has not been possible to establish whether Charoux conceived the characters for the Civilization Cyclus as a collective, or, as seems more probable given their variation and the fragmentary nature of their documentation, as sculptures that were progressively developed. To quote Charoux, "This series stems from a desire to reflect on the spiritual contents of our time. To my mind, reflection means criticism, protest, and even rebellion. It is also an insistence on freedom." Here we will consider just some of the sculptures which I believe to be part of a series of 13 characters. Motorcyclist emulates man and machine in Centaur-esque inspired form, resonant with Epstein's rock drill of 1915. However, Motorcyclist was created in response to the dire petrol shortages caused by the Suez Canal crisis in 1956. Motorcyclists can still be seen in the small garden on Chichely Street in London. Charoux was commissioned to install the neighbours at a cost of £20,000 on the newly built Highbury Quadrant housing estate in Islington. Originally titled Resting People, the neighbours promoted London County Council's socialist agenda of citizenship, trying to perpetuate the interdependence and genuine neighbourliness that Londoners had willingly demonstrated during the war years. This sculpture echoes elements of Charoux's earlier frieze of work from 1931. Draped in the Union Jack, the sculpture was unveiled in Islington on the 16th of October 1959 and remains there, now listed by Historic England. The newspaper reader is a seated workman whose arms reach forwards to hold the outer edges of a broadsheet newspaper, the inner section offering a void through which the torso may be clearly viewed. This amusing absence of news may be indicative of a political cynicism. The sculpture might also be considered an homage to Astor, then editor of The Observer, as a newspaper man, offering an informal yet discreet acknowledgement of Charoux's benefactor. The Strap-Hanging Commuter, portraying a suited middle-class office worker whose right arm is aloft to secure his position, while his left hand clutches a newspaper tightly to his chest. The acutely inclined angle of his downward gaze betrays his uncrowded stance on the underground. The simplicity of this sculpture suggests London's liberal tolerance, where education, free speech, uncensored printed materials, a choice of profession, and the liberty to roam at will were explicit post-war freedoms. Charoux rarely illustrated his experience of war. However, surely the most poignant of his sculptures is The Survivor. The maquette for this study was most recently exhibited at the Ben Uri Gallery's Out of Austria exhibition in 2018. The survivor's hunched shoulders, haunted thousand-yard stare, and introspective posture instantly conveyed the emotional abyss experienced by those traumatized by war, perhaps best captured in Eric Remarque's quotation from All Quiet on the Western Front. Our legs won't function, our hands are trembling, and our bodies are like thin membranes stretched over barely repressed madness, holding in what would otherwise be an unrestrained outburst of endless screams. The grotesque emphasis on the inflamed skeletal lungs was shockingly symbolic of the struggle to sustain breath and life, especially where toxic gas had been deployed in the trenches and gas chambers. Survivor remains a startling depiction of a person who has endured not only war, but also its bitter psychological aftermath. Commissioned by Judge Gerald Gardiner, the Labour Lord High Chancellor from 1964 to 70, the judge embraces the finessing of mass with a strategically absent void, which emphasized a faceless anonymity. The life-size version of which now sits in the reception of the Queen's Building at the Royal Courts of Justice and was viewed by Queen Elizabeth II when she opened the building in 1968. The judge was unlikely to have represented Gardiner, an unusually progressive legislator who defended the highly controversial liberalisation of literary censorship, including the unabridged publication of D.H. Lawrence's scandalous novel, Lady Chatterley's Lover in 1960, and the Murder, Abolition of Death Penalty Act in 1965, heralding a radically transformed, free-thinking Britain. In Vienna, Charoux had been awarded the Great Prize for Sculpture in 1948. Post-war, Charoux's public sculptures were also acknowledged by his home country, when in 1958 he was nominated for the title of Professor of Sculpture. However, he did not receive the honorary title, perhaps because of his liberal beliefs. Yet he continued to receive several Viennese commissions, including the Bertha von Suttner monument. Von Suttner, a pacifist, having been the second woman and first Austrian to win the Nobel Peace Prize, her literary masterpiece against war titled Lay Down Your Arms had been published in 1889. In 1966, Charoux was further acclaimed with Vienna's prestigious Gold Medal of Honor. Charoux and Marguerite had returned to Vienna in 1947, when the possibility of replacing the original Lessing monument was initially discussed, though nothing was finalized. In the 1960s, Charoux began to recreate his masterpiece, which the city of Vienna later commissioned. Despite Charoux's best efforts, due to the lapsed 30 years, it proved impossible to recreate his earlier aesthetic, given the dynamic evolution of his sculpture practice. 3 important changes were made in the pose. The left hand was lowered from the heart, and the right, rather than the left knee, was now raised. Most significantly, however, the sculpture no longer looks optimistically forwards. Instead, the eyes are downcast in solemn remembrance of the Holocaust. Importantly, the replacement Lessing monument was eventually installed again in the Judenplatz in 1981, co-located in 2000 with Rachel Whiteread's Nameless Library, the Holocaust Memorial. Frequently mentioned in the Times Court circulars, Charoux had, through the sincerity of his personality and the exhibition of his accessible and engaging public sculptures, attained deserved celebration within his adopted British homeland. He had also established lasting friendships with many members of the British establishment, including, amongst others, Astor, Cripps, Orwell, and Judge Gardiner. After his death on the 26th of April 1967, the following year, the Royal Academy honoured Charoux with a retrospective exhibition. Yet despite such a successful professional and cultural integration, in his heart, Charoux remained Viennese. And so, whilst he had enjoyed London and its tolerance, the home he occupied with Marguerite, I quote, always exhaled a continental atmosphere. Initially, he was buried in his beloved woods in Lower Austria, then later in the Central Cemetery in Vienna, where his friend George Ehrlich was also laid to rest. But what of his legacy? With Astor's assistance, Marguerite, then aged 72, endeavoured to have the studio transformed into a museum where Charoux sculptures could be appreciated. Unfortunately, a protest to the local council prevented this from happening, thus directly contributing to a lacuna in the British memory of Charoux's remarkable legacy. Indefatigably, Marguerite explored alternative options, and ultimately arrangements were made for Charoux's sculptures to be returned to Austria, as my colleague Gregor will discuss. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I'm delighted to have been invited to speak to you as a representative of the Langenzersdorf Museum, Lower Austria, and custodian of the estate of Siegfried Charoux at this very special event. I would like to conclude today's presentations by clarifying the return of Charoux's legacy to Austria. Following Charoux's death in London in 1967, Marguerite Charoux searched for several years for somewhere to display her husband's collection. The Langenzersdorf Museum, formerly Hanak Museum, which already exhibited the works of Anton Hanak, was finally considered to be a suitable location. although Siegfried Charoux neither had a special connection to Langenzersdorf nor ever visited the small village close to Vienna in Lower Austria. So let me explain to you how Charoux's works finally made their way to Langenzersdorf. According to a questionnaire prepared for the Austrian Artist Encyclopedia, which Siegfried Charoux completed in 1947, he stated that he was, for a short time, a student at the Vienna School of Arts and Crafts under Professor Anton Hanak. Yet the attendance register does not include his name. Charoux did, however, begin private tuition under Joseph Heu, and from 1922 to 1924 he studied at the Academy of Fine Arts, Vienna, under Hans Bitterlich. Anton Hanak, who was born in 1875 in Brno, Czech Republic, moved to Vienna at the age of 14. After his studies at the Academy of Fine Arts, he became one of the most renowned Austrian sculptors in the first third of the 20th century. He was companion and friend of the famous Austrian painter Gustav Klimt and the architect Joseph Hoffmann, with whom he often cooperated. He was teacher of about 150 sculptors, both men and women, the most famous of whom is Fritz Wotrowa. Anton Hanak lived in Langenzersdorf for over 20 years, from 1901 to 1922. For that reason, the Hanak Museum, now Langenzersdorf Museum in Langenzersdorf, was opened in June 1970. For over 50 years, the museum's mission has been to present the life and the work of this unique and important representative of modern Austrian sculpture to the public, and also to exhibit the work of Hanak's contemporaries and successors. Margarete Charoux's entry in the Hanak Museum's guest book on 26 October 1970 confirms her visit shortly after its opening. Margarete was obviously seeking inspiration with the intention of building a similar museum in London for her husband's artistic bequest. You can see Margarete's signature on the top left. As her plan of transforming Charoux's former studio on Temple Fortune Hill into a museum failed, because the property is located in a residential area, Margarete searched for an alternative place for her husband's collection. The Austrian art historian and journalist Elisabeth Koller-Glück admired Charoux's work but never had the chance to meet the sculptor during his lifetime. However, after Charoux's death, she visited his former Viennese studio at Am Fuchsenfeld in the 12th district of Vienna and became acquainted with Charoux's widow Margarete. Mrs. Koller-Glück finally visited Charoux's London studio at Temple Fortune Hill, which deeply impressed her. During the visit, Margarete told Mrs. Koller-Glück about the regular visits of art students and their teachers to the studio and her wish to leave her husband's work for posterity. Immediately, Mrs. Koller-Glück suggested the Hanak Museum in Langenzersdorf. She thought that particularly this museum would be an appropriate place for Charoux's work. In conclusion, Mrs. Koller-Glück promised Margarete to acquaint her with Erich Gusel, the custodian of the Hanak Museum. Margarete and Mr. Gusel first met on 20 October 1978 at Mrs. Koller-Glück's home in Vienna. Margarete proposed to donate the Charoux collection to the community of Langenzersdorf if it was possible to set up appropriate exhibition halls and a sculpture garden. Hereafter, negotiations with the community of Langenzersdorf began. These negotiations resulted in the conversion of a former garage adjacent to the Hanak Museum into the new Charoux Museum. 2 stories would be added onto the single-floored garage. The ground floor and the second floor would be built as exhibition halls. The first floor would be used for an office and storage. The construction work started on 2nd June 1980. The building costs were personally funded by Margarete and by subsidies from the community of Langenzersdorf, the province of Lower Austria, the city of Vienna, and by several private sponsors. On 1st October 1980, the topping out of the new building was celebrated. On 11th August 1981, 2 trucks loaded with Charoux's works arrived from England. Sculptures, oil paintings, watercolors, sketches, furniture, and memorabilia. In preparation, Margarete and Mr. Gusel had already made the first inventory of the collection prior to clearing the studio in London. During the construction of the museum, Margarete visited the building site several times and checked the progress of the works. Gradually, the sculptures and the paintings were installed in the exhibition halls. In addition, sculptures were also located in the museum's garden, as many had been in the garden at Temple Fortune Hill. The opening of the Charoux Museum took place on 12 June 1982. Unfortunately, Margarete Charoux, now aged 87, was unable to attend the opening because she was in hospital. Margarete visited the newly opened Charoux Museum on 12 October 1982, happy that Charoux's work had finally found a new and permanent home. Margarete was awarded Honorary Citizen of Langenzersdorf on 21st October 1982. After visiting the Charoux Museum again in 1983 and 1984, Margarete died in London on 18 January 1985 at the age of 89. The estate of Siegfried Charoux preserves, exhibits, and promotes the artistic work of Siegfried Charoux and endeavors to fulfill Margarete's wish of delivering her husband's bequest for posterity. From 2009 to 2014, the museum's building complex has been completely refurbished and all the exhibition halls were renovated. During the reconstruction works, many of Charoux's sculptures and paintings have been conserved. The sculptures formerly installed in the garden have been also restored and moved indoors for conservation purposes. A large number of Charoux's sculptures were made of terracotta or synthetic resin mixed with other materials. After exhibiting them outdoors over several decades, many have been found to be UV sensitive and are not weatherproof. As a central part of the refurbishment works, a major new exhibition hall has been built, which now accommodates the presentation of special exhibitions in addition to the museum's permanent collections. The new Langenzersdorf Museum was opened on 17 May 2014. On the following slides, you can see the upper and the lower floor of the Charoux galleries. In 2017, a special exhibition, Siegfried Charoux, the Sculptor as a Painter, commemorating the 50th anniversary of the death of the artist, curated Charoux's paintings, drawing, and sculptures in contrasting juxtaposition for the very first time. This special exhibition was accompanied by several lectures, workshops, events, and particularly the brochure Siegfried Charoux, Sculptor and Painter, detailing Charoux's biography and illustrating exemplary sculptures, paintings, and archive pictures from the Charoux archive at the Langenzersdorf Museum. The brochure was first presented on 8 October 2017. Especially prepared for today's event, an English text translation of the German edition is available. The special exhibition Treasures of Modernism from 2nd September 2020 to 29 August 2021, celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Langenzersdorf Museum, included, beside works by other artists with a connection to the museum, sculptures, paintings, and drawings by Siegfried Charoux. The next slide shows exhibition insights. For the very first time, parts of Charoux's private art collection, including works donated by contemporary artists and friends, such as Bronzia Cola-Pinel, Franz von Sülow, Franz Wiegele, Robin Christian Andersen, and Marc Chagall were also exhibited. Finally, I want to thank you for listening, and I look forward to seeing you at the Langenzersdorf Museum. And now I will join Melanie and Marc to answer your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Marc, Melanie, and Gregor. I'm sure everybody will agree with me that that was absolutely fascinating. Now, I have plenty of questions up my sleeve, but I very much hope that others too will type in any questions you may have into the chat, but perhaps I'll set the ball rolling. I'm actually not quite sure where to start because there are many aspects of his fascinating life I would love to know even more about. Perhaps looking at you, Melanie, in the first instance, a question about his left-wing political sympathies, views. What was his relationship with the Communist Party? Was he ever tempted to join officially? Did he ever join?
I've certainly not found any evidence that he did join. There is a apparently flippant comment in one publication that was written quite some time ago that states he may have had association with the Communist Party, may have been, but certainly by the time he left Vienna, he had significantly moved away from that. He was completely dedicated to democracy, freedom, and very much to, you know, people living liberally and tolerantly. Gregor, I don't know if you want to add something.
Yes, do you have any further comments on that score?
About Communist Party. Yes, he worked at a factory which produced optical lenses. And this was the first time he got in contact with clay and producing small sculptures. And there he had some friends where he joined communist or social democratic conventions. So I would think in his early days, he was very left-wing, yes, I would say. He also made a Lenin bust or a Stalin memorial, but I do not really know if he joined the Communist Party. I think there's no evidence.
What about his technique? It's one thing perhaps we could dwell on more. Again, maybe Melanie or indeed Bruce, maybe I don't know if you want to chip in on this score. Tell us more about his working methods.
Well, we found lots of chicken wire.
Yes.
Chicken wire. Carry on.
She probably used for the maquettes.
Yeah.
We found lots of cobalt glaze as well that he left behind, and hundreds of chisels. But I think, Melanie, you know more about how he constructed.
I mean, certainly he was an absolute master with terracotta. Even Anthony Charoux credits Charoux with the phenomenal development of his work. If you look at Charoux's work, something like Woman Awaking, which is in Tate Britain, it is a masterpiece in working with terracotta. And that really was his area of expertise. He developed works usually in 3 sizes. So the first one, he produced a maquette. The next size would then be about 1 meter tall. And then he would usually go for a full size. And by that, he was looking at heroic size. We're talking about works over 2 meters, about 8 foot in height. Very substantial, extremely heavy works. Works that were for public display, such as the neighbors, were usually made with the armature underneath, and then he put plaster and synthetic resin over the top of them so that they would be durable as external works that could certainly deal with the elements of the British weather being thrown at them. So yeah, but something like the Islanders, which was made only of plaster, was never intended to be a permanent construction, and certainly that was blown up immediately after the exhibition. Tragically, they'd already prepared for its removal before he even built it.
Since it's the 70th anniversary of the Festival of Britain, perhaps that's the moment to say or to ask you a little bit more about the context for Charoux's being involved with it. Do we know how the commission came about? Can you kind of contextualize his...
Yes, certainly. Hugh Casson, who was director for the Festival of Britain, was aware of Charoux's work, as indeed was Stafford Cripps, and Stafford Cripps effectively was organising a lot of the budgetary work behind this as well, and approving and signing off on that. And clearly he was friends with Charoux now. So to my mind, the direct connection came up between Charoux and Stafford Cripps. I do know that Cripps got involved in resolving an issue around some of the expenses that were accruing for just amongst other things, for the sheer amount of plaster that was required to construct the Islanders. So yeah, the connection was very much between Cripps and also Hugh Casson.
It's perhaps also the moment to mention that we've actually two relevant previous events. One apropos the Festival of Britain, on the Insiders Outsiders YouTube channel that many of you may already know about. We've got a sort of wonderful, if I say it myself, sort of resource there of past events. And one of them is a talk by Harriet Atkinson precisely on that broader subject of the émigré, not just sculptors, of course, but also designers and painters, disproportionately large, we might say, contribution to that landmark cultural event. So do look out for that. And you also mentioned the way that Charoux had been blacklisted by the Nazis in the notorious Black Book. And there's another recorded talk by Sybil Oldfield, who has actually just published a totally fascinating and profoundly disturbing book precisely on that subject, the kind of list that the Nazis drew up of persona non grata in the event of their invasion of this island. I mean, really extraordinary. So do look out for that. I can't believe there aren't more questions coming in, but there are a few, so please do keep them coming. So let's, moving to his British second life, if you like. From Richard DeFriend, a question about his relationships with other sculptors. What kind of relationship did he have with contemporaries such as Henry Moore, Elizabeth Frink, and Barbara Hepworth? Were there direct links? Melanie,
Sorry, I didn't quite hear the question, Monica.
Sorry, it's a question about his links with contemporaries such as Moore, Frink, and Barbara Hepworth.
That's a really good point. Certainly, he had a very tight network of other artists that he worked with. Those were specifically people who were associated with the Royal Academy, and also those who were émigré artists. Mm. He doesn't seem to have any direct connections to people like Henry Moore or Barbara Hepworth in terms of actually knowing them and socializing with them. He certainly had a terrific number of Moore's works in the sense of Charoux's private library actually has copies of Henry Moore's publications in there. So those were work that he studied. I think less so in terms of in studying Barbara Hepworth, being more literally figurative rather than abstract as Hepworth was. I think Charoux was drawn closer towards Moore's style. Indeed, if you look at the maquette for The Neighbours, it really emulates a lot of Moore's, the sort of gentle curvature of the figures, whereas by the time he actually produces the full-size work, then certainly that's very much of Charoux's own style. Gregor, would you like to add those comments?
Yes, I think I'm not really sure if he met Henry Moore in person, but I think he was obviously influenced at the end of the 1940s. I would say he tried to do a Newton memorial, and he began to try abstract forms, and I think he was not satisfied with the solutions, and he went back to a figurative sculpture. But I think there was a little bit influenced by Henry Moore. Yes.
My own instinct, which is not based on any sort of deep knowledge, but is that there's a closer affinity to some of the, well, not just the émigré sculptors you mentioned, but let's mention them, for the record, people like Willy Sukop and George Ehrlich, who did kind of straddle abstraction and figurative in ways that might be more accessible to a broader public, in accordance perhaps with their left-wing public, sort of oriented sympathies. Am I right, Melanie? Does that seem right to you?
Yeah, he certainly had connections with Sukop, particularly through the fact that he was involved directly in nominating to the Royal Academy and supporting them as they progressed to be elected as master of the sculpture schools. But I know, one of the connections that I do know of is with Arthur Flashman, and Arthur Flashman. They used to shade the use of the kiln. Charoux had a kiln at the back of the property, and would allow other artists to put their work in it to have it made as well.
That's interesting. I didn't know that. Yes, he was also one of the sculptors included in the Festival of Britain, I think, wasn't he, Fleischmann?
Yes, with the Miranda.
Yes, but actually even less.
Mermaid. Yeah,
less research, less known than some of the others we've mentioned. Interesting. A very practical question from Melanie Camp. The brochure that was mentioned from the retrospective, is it available for purchase, Gregor?
I think you mean this brochure? Yeah, yes, it is available. I have made a. You can write me. Is it visible? No.
Yes, it's fine.
office@lemu.at. You can write me, and yes, and I will write you back, and I send you the brochure, also with an English text translation.
Good, thank you. Come on, everybody. I simply do not believe there aren't more questions. All right. In the meantime, I'm also very curious to know more about Margareta, obviously an interesting person in her own right. Would somebody like to tell us more about her? And also, actually, just on the back of that question, I mean, being Jewish herself, as Charoux wasn't, what about the fate of her family in Austria? Do we know much about that?
Yes, we do.
Mm.
Most of the family actually managed to leave Austria. I understand there are members of Charoux's extended family who are in Latin America. I haven't made contact with them. Marguerite's mother remained behind in Austria when Austria was deteriorating, and she continued to visit her up until 1938, and then her mother sadly passed away, perhaps fortunately in terms of timing, given the fact that she was no longer there on her own.
So in other words, I mean, yes, the Holocaust cuts quite close, doesn't it? I mean, you know,
very close.
World War I experience is crucial, but also, indeed. Another very practical but important question from Marilyn Green. Other than the neighbours in Islington, are there any other public works still in existence by him in London and indeed more broadly in the UK?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I've tried to sort of feature the ones that are available. So neighbours in Islington, you've also got the Motorcyclist, which is on Chicheley Street in London. It's if you go to the London Eye and then walk a block back, hopefully you'll be able to find it there. It's fairly easy to be able to find it. There's supposed to be a work in a convent, which I'm still trying to gain access to, but unfortunately I believe there is a convent where they maintain a vow of silence. So communication has been a little bit difficult, even written, to see if we can get access to that.
I wonder if any members.
His most spectacular works. I would, for anyone who would like to see his works, I would wholeheartedly encourage you to visit Vienna, because certainly being able to see the Lessing Monument, also the Frieze of Works, and also the Bertha von Suttner memorial as well. They're just stunning pieces of work. Gregor, would you like to add to that for Vienna?
Yes, I think that's true, and also come to the museum, which shows
absolutely,
which shows you're heartily invited. Which shows the most parts of Charoux's artistic bequest. We are not able to show everything because he was also a painter, and he painted lots of oil paintings, and he also made thousands of sketches. But we try to do special exhibitions and to show also his drawings and also his paintings.
Did you talk about the relationship between his activity as a sculptor and as a painter or indeed draftsman at all? Can you say something about that?
Yes, he was drawing for his life, all for his life. He began in his early childhood to draw in the countryside, and also to portray people. And then he became a caricaturist for the Workers' Journal, and he met some friends who were related to artists such as Bronzia Colla-Pinel, who is very famous in Austria. He's one of the most famous paintresses in the first third of the 20th century, and Robin Christian Andersen, he was influenced by Cézanne. Also, in my presentation, I showed the still life, which was the cover of our Treasures of Modernism exhibition, and I think it's very deeply influenced by the works by Cézanne. And in the last years, there is such a juxtaposition and between his sculptures and his paintings. There's a strong relation between his paintings and his sculptures in his very last works.
Some more questions coming in about the physical location of works. Melanie Camper, remembering that in the 1980s, when visiting the festival hall, I saw the sculptures of the pianist and the violinist, I believe. What became of them?
There was a sculpture, the cellist, which was on the higher terrace outside the Festival of Britain. Sadly, it was taken away when they were doing repair works, and it has never reappeared. I believe it's somewhere in the Arts Council's storage areas, and we've not been able to gain access to it. But yes, that one was there for quite considerable length of time.
And then a question from Susanna White about the judge in the Royal Courts of Justice. Is that still there?
Yes, it is.
So
You
that
can go and
is-
see it. You need to be prepared for some fairly stringent security checks as you go through. But if you explain that you would like to go and see the sculpture, they will allow you to go through, because it is actually a public building, but you are thoroughly checked, and they do not allow you to take photographs of the sculpture.
But it's there.
But it's there. It's also appeared in a film recently with Emma Thompson in it called, I've forgotten the name of the film, but it was about Emma Thompson played a judge deciding on a young child's right for life, and they actually made a copy of it.
The Children Act?
The Children's Act.
Yes,
the Children Act with Emma
indeed.
Thompson.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Interesting.
There was made a copy, of the judge.
No, I missed that.
I got approved a copy being made. Would you like to tell us about that experience?
If I wanted to talk about it, it's very interesting because it seems it was very complicated to get a model from the Royal Courts of Justice, and so they made a copy from our small maquette of the judge, and they combined it with a photograph of the judge, and I think it's a very good copy of the sculpture. It was very interesting and funny also.
Right, from Anne Raudors, an interesting intervention saying that we ourselves have a couple of his watercolors that he did in Kew Gardens. Are there any insights into this place and his work? Is that something you're aware of?
I know he did very many watercolors. A terrific number of them are registered from the directory that the Royal Academy have of all the works that were shown there. I'm not aware of him having exhibited separately at Kew Gardens. It's not beyond the bounds of possibility that he did. It may just be that we've not got any evidence of a catalogue still for a work there. Or alternatively, it may be a work that has actually been at the Royal Exhibition and sold on from there. I'm not sure.
Interesting, and a nice question from Fiona and Paul. I can't see the surname very much apropos for today's event. Did Charoux himself share, for example, in his writings, his reflections about the studio in Hampstead Garden Suburb and what it meant to him? How did it enable him to think, design and sculpt? How much did he himself feel that it expressed his spirit?
I'll make a comment first, and then Mark may add something. Charoux wrote a number of articles that were really encouraging the British government to provide studios at affordable rents for artists. Having had the experience in Funchsenfeld studio in Austria, it was something he was completely committed to, and he simply didn't understand why the British government were not as supportive to artists as the Viennese government had been. So in terms of him writing about studios, yes, he was very positive about it. I haven't personally found anything where he'd written specifically about living and working in this studio, but what we have is a whole body of evidence in terms of the photographic evidence. Mark, would you like to add to that?
Really, the only comment I could offer is that clearly it was, although it was really towards the end of his life that he was here in this studio, he put it to really extensive use. What wasn't possible to photograph when we moved here adequately was the scale of what I would call was adjacent to the jewel of the studio we're sitting in, with its balanced light and the repose, was pretty much an industrial production unit alongside on the west. And for example, I was at the wrong end of it in the sense that 15 years of dried terracotta occupied something that would equate to the salt bunkers of a local council for winter use, all of which had to be dug out in order to retrieve the garden and restate the setting. But he was heavily invested in the industrial scale production of his work. This was not a mere showroom and shop where someone stood at an easel and made paintings in that way. This was really strenuous production of large pieces at one remove from the street, which itself posed its own problems when they then had to be moved and taken to where they would be scaled up or whatever. So it was a very, very serious commitment on his part to being a productive practicing artist. And I think that has always made a great impression on me, that he, as it were, retreated here to regroup and re-express. And it's a very powerful sense in the place.
Nice, nice. Gregor, we have just a very practical request. Could you just hold up your email address for those who aren't so good at copying and pasting?
So, is it visible?
Yes, it's visible.
Okay.
Very good, thank you. A question, I think, from Rachel Kolsky. I might have missed it, but I don't think you did, Rachel. But where did Charoux actually live and work before Hampstead Garden Suburb? Where was his previous studio in this country?
Holland Park Road. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, he had a number of.
Yeah, can you give us the locations?
The first one was British Grove that he came to, and then he moved around broadly in this area, but he started off sort of more centrally in London and then progressively moved out here.
British Grove is near Notting Hill.
Yeah, British Grove is near Notting Hill, so that's sort of northwest. He was in a few addresses certainly early on, as he, you know, once they first moved here and tried to become established. It was only really after his connection with David Astor that things settled down a little bit, and certainly Astor purchased this house, and effectively there was agreement of a long-term tenancy with this home and Astor's office.
I think you mentioned, Melanie, that he first met David Astor at a cocktail party, and I sort of pricked up my ears there. I mean, what kind of social circles was he mixing in that enabled him to meet somebody like David Astor at a crucial moment?
Well, that's the intriguing part, because suddenly you go from almost somebody who can't speak English at all. You have to remember, when he left Vienna, he had no reason whatsoever to speak English. So he arrived here and literally put the radio on to start learning how to speak English. And he really did focus on the children's programs because he found the language simpler, the pronunciation was made clearly, and that's how he began to speak. To then suddenly, within about 18 months, he's starting to participate in social events. What the link of that was, I really don't know. I suspect it was actually just his sheer charm of turning up at events and inviting himself in almost, or he may have met one or two other established artists who invited him and brought him along. So difficult to know how he did that, but he certainly was hugely charming and very effective at being warmly welcomed into British society.
I think immediately of possible parallels there with people like Franka Belski, who, you know, becomes the sculptor of the royal family within a record amount of time, or indeed Oskar Neman of Yugoslav Jewish origin. You know, sort of what are those key connections, you know, that make this possible?
As far as I know, David Astor was interested to get in contact with émigré artists, and there were several circles of émigré artists, and as far as I know, Charoux got in contact with Astor at these communities. Yeah.
But this question of the broader social networking involved is a fascinating one. And I think a lot more research still needs to be done. And perhaps that's the moment, Melanie, to mention that you yourself are writing a monograph. Yes, very much work in progress still. So everybody should look out for that. Any more questions coming through? All right, well, looking at the time, it's probably almost time to conclude, but I can't help ending with what might seem perhaps a little bit provocative, but I hope not insensitive question. It seems to me, I mean, it's wonderful that Charoux's work, the estate, is now under the custodianship of Hugh Gregor and of the museum in Lower Austria, but isn't it somewhat, I sort of choose my words carefully, shameful, embarrassing, somehow wrong that actually the country that gave him shelter, where he did indeed work very productively for several decades at the end of his life, you know, he couldn't find, his widow couldn't find a suitable place for the body of work to remain here. And Melanie, perhaps again, a question for you, but there is a certain irony there, and I think it really should give us pause for thought. You know, then in fact, connected with that, a practical question. I mean, where did Margareta look? Did she try venues? You know, obviously she wasn't able to preserve the house and studio, unfortunately, but what sort of places did she turn to as possible, you know, sort of, yeah, places of repositories for his work? Do we know?
No, certainly it was very disappointing that the studio itself was not approved as an open studio and a museum. It is in a residential area, and therefore, understandably, it was just deemed that it wasn't appropriate to hold this. Marguerite, her main port of call was then to approach Asta, because she was, as I say, 72 years old at that stage, and it was quite a task. And I don't think she had the same social network that Charoux did. I know that enquiries were made, but unfortunately nowhere else was able to be found, and it was only really with the connection back to Austria that it was, you know, very importantly made there. I think one of the things I, you know, also like to add on this in terms of putting together the monograph, this has been done in conjunction with the Langenstensdorf Museum, and certainly, you know, Gregor and his colleagues have been tremendously helpful in providing information and endless requests. I've visited a number of times, and I would, you know, recommend anybody else who's interested to go along and have a look there. But your point is valid, Monica, that, you know, Austria's gain was Britain's loss.
Yeah, you know, it's full of ironies, isn't it? Absolutely.
Indeed.
All right, and on that, hopefully quite thought-provoking.
May I say one other word?
Yes,
I
of
would
course you
just
can.
also like to, before we do close, say a very significant thank you to Martin Veasey for all of the technical work that he's done behind the scenes, and without his assistance, we wouldn't have been able to hold this event. So thank you, Martin.
Yes.
Indeed,
Yeah.
absolutely. Here.
Thank you.
Right, a question from, I think it's Melanie Camp again. May I have the other Melanie's email address? Yes, of course. Write to Insiders Outsiders, the address on the website, Melanie, and I can forward your email to Melanie Veasey with great pleasure.
I
Very
look
good.
forward to talking to you, Melanie Cam.
Good, lovely. Well, much more could be said, but I think time rolls on, and we'll draw things to a close. So once again, many thanks to everybody who worked so hard towards making this happen in this I think very vivid, albeit virtual form. And thank you to the rest of you who were here. I do note that quite a few people who had signed up and indeed paid up haven't come, and I don't know if they're at all people known to some of those of you who are here, but we will be making the recording of this available sort of just to the general public in due course. But for those of you who did pay but weren't able to come, or indeed who would like to listen to it again, get in touch again through the Insiders Outsiders website, and we'll be very happy to send you the recording. Lots of thanks coming in, absolutely. Good, lovely, thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of the day. All right, all the best.
Thank you, everyone.
Actually,
Thank you. Bye.
just one last thing I've just remembered apropos internment. You mentioned en passant, for those who don't know much about it, perhaps quite tantalizingly, that he was interned in Hutchinson Camp. Now, the creative life of the British internment camps in 1940-41 is a fascinating topic. Again, much new research being done. And in fact, Insiders Outsiders has just started a whole sequence of online events on that subject. But I particularly wanted to mention one that will be, I think, of direct interest to those of you listening today. And that's focusing quite specifically on the creative life of Hutchinson internment camp with Jackie Richardson, who is the daughter of Klaus Hinrichsen, who, as I think Melanie will know, was an art historian, German origin, who became the chronicler of that rich artistic life. And she'll be in conversation with Simon Parkin, who is very soon to publish a whole book on Hutchinson called The Island of Extraordinary Captives, and that's on the 7th of October. So you can find it on the Insiders Outsiders website in the What's On section if you're interested. So perhaps we will see you there. Enough already, as they say. Lots of thanks coming in. All the very best. Again, thanks ever so much, everyone. Take care. Good night, goodbye, good afternoon. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.